Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Emergency Response Preparedness, What to Do While Waiting for Responders. My name's James, I run webinars and events here at Triumvirate Environmental, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before we dive into the presentation and hand things over to our speaker, I just want to run through a few housekeeping items so everyone knows what to expect. Please note that everyone's microphones will be turned off for the entirety of the webinar, but if you have a question or a technical issue comes up, you may use the questions box to communicate. Following today's presentation, there will be an open question and answer period, and you can ask questions anytime by typing them into that questions box. Any that we don't get to, we'll be sure to follow up on in the coming days. Please keep in mind you will receive a copy of the slide deck and the recording tomorrow, so keep an eye out for that. And we'll also be announcing an offer at the end of the webinar, so stick around for that. And Kevin, I think we'll advance over to your slide so we can introduce our speaker today, Kevin Coulon. Kevin is the Regional Services Director for Field Services at Triumvirate Environmental. In this role, he manages the wastewater department, routine field service, decontamination, and on-site support. He also manages the emergency response program for all of New England, overseeing the program and responses. He provides assessments of facilities from a regulatory standpoint and provides detailed reports to help clients reach full environmental and safety compliance. So with that, I will turn things over to Kevin.
Thanks, James. So for today, we're going to be talking about kind of a tough time when it comes for emergency response, and that's the time from when you identify that you have an emergency to when you actually have help that shows up. And today's talk is going to go through some scenarios, some critical information that's going to help you during that time period while you're waiting to find out when your people will be on site to help you clean it up. Go over a couple ER calls that are out there that have come in that we've seen that aren't the greatest calls to help respond to a spill. Some ways to prepare, how to better prepare your facility in the event you do have an emergency. And then talking about what makes it worst case versus best case scenario for an emergency response. Everybody wants to avoid an emergency response, but they do sometimes happen. And when they do happen, we want to make those from being at the very first, at the beginning, it's worst case, but how do we make that a best case scenario? And then we'll end the day with some questions that if people have them throughout the presentation, please send them in. We'll address questions at the end of the presentation. So jump into a couple different scenarios. We're going to talk 4 different scenarios that are out there. There's the big one, there's chemical. A lot falls under chemical as to what would be under a scenario, whether it's during a chemical delivery, whether it's waste, if you're transporting waste through hauls, if it's in production. A spill for an emergency is not always a hazardous waste. It could be a hazardous substance, could be a virgin material, but oftentimes it's sometimes looked at as it's a waste chemical is what caused the emergency. But in a lot of cases, more so than not, it's a product or a virgin material that causes a spill as opposed to waste. You could have a spill to the environment, whether it's oil, diesel. One thing that's not always looked at as a spill to the environment is if you have a spill inside your facility and you have floor drains, where do those floor drains go? Do you have a tank that it goes to that you can shut off, or are you a direct to sewer discharge? If you're a direct to sewer discharge, you've now affected the environment and you have a spill to the environment. And that's one that's often overlooked as where the piping goes within your building if something was to go down the drain. We're going to touch on confined spaces and then unknown odors. This is actually a big topic, and there's a lot of documentation around it, especially around OSHA and also around response under RCRA when it comes to an unknown atmosphere, an unknown odor. There's a lot of steps that need to be taken in order to respond to something that's considered a true unknown. We're going to spend a little bit of time on unknowns and go over a couple specific scenarios that have come through that we've seen. A couple I've actually responded to myself, and just go through some of some of the steps that were taken. So before we jump into them, just want to ask a question of which scenario are you most concerned about?
Thanks for teeing that up, Kevin. Everyone should see the question on your screen. The options are chemical, spill to the environment, confined space, unknown odor, and other. And if you select other, feel free to type your response into the questions box and we can share it with the group. We'll push out the results in a few seconds. All right, we've got almost everyone in, so let's close that and share the results. So Kevin, we've got 43% chose chemical, 30% spill to the environment, and 11% each for confined space and unknown odor, and only 4% selected other.
All right, thanks, James. So a big concern across the board is definitely chemical. There's a lot that goes into chemical, whether it's a product or if it's a waste. And then there's sometimes where you may have if you have contractors that are working at your facility, who's responsible for their chemicals? So as we go into the ways to prepare, we can talk a little bit about contractors as well, working on your site that could cause an emergency response that involves a chemical. And then we'll spill to the environment, give a little bit more insight on that, as well as the unknown odor in confined space. So jumping into chemical, a few things that we have up here are unstable chemicals found during moves or cleanouts. So if you're in a facility where you're relocating, knowing what you have for chemicals and keeping a current chemical inventory are going to help identify where you may have potentially energetic compounds, whether they're peroxide formers, if they're chemicals that need to be refrigerated, if they're light sensitive, if they're air sensitive. Knowing where those are can help prevent a scenario where you have an emergency with an unstable chemical that's found. And we've run across this a lot where a researcher goes in to grab a chemical. Couple instances where sodium amide is peroxide former, where it turned from a white to a brown substance where there's evidence of peroxides in it. And at that point, you now have an unstable compound in an area where people are working in with not the right PPE to deal with that type of material. Becomes an emergency and often needs to involve other agencies, including the fire department. So that one takes a lot of precedence when you're going for an emergency scenario around a chemical. It's not exactly a spill, but it's still an emergency response because you have the potential of a high risk with that particular chemical. There's gas cylinders. This can either be during deliveries. It can also be, and we've seen this happen, where cylinders are not chained. If a cylinder is not chained, could one accidentally fall over, you break the valve, and now you have a gas that's leaking into the atmosphere. Another scenario that we've come across is actually, as a building was expanding, found 4 cylinders buried in the ground, which were all unknown, and those need to be treated as unknown cylinders. Luckily, after doing an investigation, those were acetylene, but you still have to treat it as an unknown because you don't know if they're full or what's in them. Chemical spill in a lab setting or on a floor setting. If you're a manufacturing facility, you could have a machine let go and you spill chemicals on the floor. If there's any floor drains, what do you have for prevention to protect those floor drains so you don't have a chemical going down and a potential release to the environment? Another chemical out there of big concern is mercury, because mercury also has occupancy levels that you need to reach in order to let people back into the areas. As mercury, if you do have a spill, if it starts to become in the atmosphere, you're going to need respiratory protection. That's going to result in an evacuation of that particular room, if not your whole floor, while you wait for someone to come in and clean it and do the monitoring and air monitoring, whether it's under air at first and when they can drop down to using an APR, air purifying respirator. And the other one that's common We've actually been seeing this one a lot, is spills during chemical delivery. And this could either be a chemical falls down in the crack between where the truck meets the loading dock. We've seen it where they're using a lift gate to remove a chemical and it actually fell off the lift gate and you have a spill. Now you have a spill to the environment. And the other chemical is actually, it's spilled to the environment but losing a hydraulic line during a chemical delivery. So there's a lot of instances and a lot of, across all niches, you can find that there's issues with chemical responses. It's not always in a lab setting or in a higher education setting. It could be in a manufacturing facility where, you know, a machine lets go all of its fluid and now you need to do a response. The next big one that I believe it was that everybody said is their second choice is spill to the environment. When it comes to the spill to the environment, there's some big things that come into how to make a scenario a best case scenario. Any spill to the environment is sometimes your worst case, but knowing the volume that's spilled and depending on which state you're in is going to depict who's going to be involved. If you're in Connecticut, for instance, any spill to the environment requires calling the DEP. If you're in Massachusetts, it depends on what volume it is and if it's on the mass contingency plan. So there's differences to know what the volume is when it does spill to the environment. If it's something that's spilled inside of your facility and now it goes out through your storm drains or it goes out through your discharge, you now have a spill to not only the environment, but you may also have to let your downstream POTW know that you had a spill. So now beyond DEP, you're involving your POTW. The volume of whether it's 5 gallons or to the extreme could be a tanker as you see the truck rolled over. There have been tanker spills that have happened. They commonly happen on the road. Fortunately, it can be common, but we've had in the last couple of years, there was a tanker that rolled over in Connecticut and a tanker that rolled over down at one of the rotaries heading on to Cape Cod in Massachusetts. These do happen and you have a large spill to the environment. You should understand what your reporting requirements are if you do have a spill to the environment. Now, we are talking about this wait time as to when you find it to when your responders come in. But the reporting requirements for each state differ, whether you need to report immediately, within 12 hours, within 24 hours. So you need to know that time frame so you can be making these calls while you're waiting for your cleanup company to show up. One thing you should take into account is if you're on a property that has wetlands nearby, are you within the 100-foot radius? There's a protection of the wetlands, so if you have a spill within that area, you may have to go beyond DEP and now you have your Wetlands Commission that's involved. And then there's also storm drains. Can your storm drains be shut off? If you do have a spill to the environment, do you have covers for those storm drains to prevent the spill from reaching the storm drains? Now what happens if there's a spill directly over one? Well, you'd want to go a couple storm drains either side and put boom in there to protect the chemical from going past a couple storm drains from where the actual spill was. Confined space is something that's always a tough one. It's not a tough one in regards to response. With trained people, you can respond to a confined space emergency response. However, you may have staff that think if I just reach in a little bit, it's fine, I'm going to help out. So you want to make sure you're training your people that a confined space is truly that, and they are dangerous. And making sure that people are not trying to become a hero when there's a spill. Confined spaces have been areas where you can have an OSHA recordable or you could have the worst, which is actually a fatality. So having trained people when you have an emergency response, letting people know that they don't have to clean this up and they shouldn't be cleaning it up if it's a confined space without the proper PPE. Some scenarios that we've seen that have happened: hydraulic oil releases into elevator shafts. This one, you're going to have a couple companies involved. You're going to have your elevator company involved, and you're also going to have your emergency response company involved. In order to enter it, you want to make sure that your elevator company comes in, raises the car, and locks it out, so that way the responders can start doing their work, because you want to make sure not only are your people safe, but the people that are entering, that are trained for the confined space entry and rescue, they also need to be safe from that elevator car to make sure it's fully locked out. You could have a hydraulic oil release into a catch basin. We just touched on this with storm drains. Storm drains and catch basins, often referred to as the same. They do have some differences, but each catch basin is going to be connected. And if you do have a release to a catch basin, how deep is it, and are you going to have to enter it? Some of them, you may not be able to get it from above, and you do have to enter. Or there could be a clog in a catch basin where you're entering. But making sure that who comes to respond to that is fully trained will make that a best case scenario for having to do an entry into a catch basin. And then also treatment tanks. We talked about if you have drains within your building, where do those pipes go? Do the pipes go to a treatment tank? And if they are going into a treatment tank, is it going to be more than just pumping the tank out to remove the material? Are you going to need that tank fully washed? So if you're getting in to do the wash, now you have a confined space. There are some ways around the catch basin and the treatment tanks to make it so it doesn't require confined space, where you're using, you could be using a long handle with a pressure washer where your body's not actually breaking the plane. I only say it meets it for catch basin and treatment tanks and not for the elevator shaft, because you're going to be leaning into the elevator shaft to do the work. So you still want to have all the protection and also the fall protection to make sure that they don't fall into that elevator shaft. Unknown odor is one that is not really planned for when it comes up, but this could be a spill of an unknown material. It could be a complaint from somebody that they smell a chemical, but they're not sure what it is. So as you go into the unknown odor, there are some things to really think about and prepare yourself for this. And that's, one, can you isolate the area? Is it only in one lab or one work area and only one person is affected by it, or other places in that particular area affected, and can you isolate just that one area, or does it go all the way to a full evacuation of everybody from your entire building because of an unknown smell? And then investigation, this can be the biggest help with an unknown odor. Investigation, you want to get as much information from either the person who is affected, if they're still there, or from the manager of that person, and then also get an inventory of what's being used in that area. It's going to help narrow down what the hazards are in that particular area, and also help your responders understand what they're walking into. Now, when you have an unknown atmosphere, you are going to have at least 4 people that are going to show up, where you have 2 in and 2 out, and they'll be following a full incident command system. There are some scenarios that have come up in the past. There was one that happened about 10 years ago, and that involved a refrigerator. And what happened with the refrigerator is no one knew that it malfunctioned, and the freezer defrosted and leaked water all into the refrigerator section, and the fridge was full of water reactives. So what happened was all the bins storing the chemicals were filled with water, and it broke the seals of the chemicals and released gas within the refrigerator. What then happened is there were people that were sent to the hospital because they were knocked unconscious because of the gas. In that case, they were able to isolate the room. The refrigerator had closed after the person went down. The people who else were in the room pulled them out, They isolated the room. They turned on their HVAC to be at a higher flow, and they didn't allow anybody into that lab. But it did take about 2 hours of investigation under air to figure out what caused it, and from there could identify what the gases were, because the question was also being asked, well, what were they affected by? And it turned out that water reacted with a chemical to make hydrogen sulfide, which had knocked the people out. There was another recent one that happened where another unknown odor came from a lab that someone called in with the smell of almonds. And in that case, if you deal with cyanides, the common phrase is, if you can smell almonds or taste almonds, it's too late. In this case, the generator took it as full unknown, did the investigation. Towards the end, actually became a little comical to become best case, because it was a almond air freshener that was plugged into the lab because they didn't like the smell of the chemicals that were being used in the lab, so they thought they would make it smell better. It was a lab that heavily used cyanides. It was a little comical in the end, but it was treated as a true unknown. And you have to treat every unknown as it is. You don't know the atmosphere that you're walking into. So going from a couple scenarios, want to touch on some critical information that's really going to help turn these type of scenarios into a best case scenario. And what do you really need to provide to everybody, and what do you need to get from your people on site to help you prepare for your responders showing up on site? The big critical information is going to be the where. The where, what's the location of the spill? Is it in a confined space? Is it in a lab? Is it outside? Where is everybody located? Is it downwind, upwind? Where's your excavation, your evacuation rally point? The what is, you're going to get this through your investigation as to what spilled. The who is a couple different things. Who was hurt? Who is the main contact? And who as into what authorities are going to be there, as DEP, EPA, OSHA, DPH, who will also be there for when your responders show up. And the when, how long ago did it spill, is there, if it's to the environment, when is the next rain event coming? If you have a spill of oil on the ground and there's rain that's supposed to come in the next 2 to 3 hours, you need to take some additional measures to ensure that when it does rain, you don't have a larger spill when it gets to one of your storm drains or catch basins. And then the how. What caused the spill? How was it spilled? And how did you leave the area? If it was a spill within a lab area, did you open all the sashes to your fume hoods to get the maximum airflow? Or do you have a button in your lab that you can press that doubles the amount of air that's exchanged? Was there a window that was left open to allow fresh air? Those how you left it, how did it happen, are really going to help your team that's showing up to help you respond be prepared for when they get on site. Some behavioral incidents. The majority of incidents we respond to are usually at night. We did one 2 weeks ago from a Sunday to a Monday night where someone came in, they wanted to get ready for their job the following morning and cut a couple corners and actually knocked over an oil drum that spilled and released to the environment. They also happen over the weekend or early Monday morning as people are coming in, holidays, or late in the day on a Friday. It's often when people are rushing to get out that you have an emergency. You have other things on your mind, you're trying to move quickly, and as you walk by, your elbow hits a bottle off of a shelf, and now you have an emergency response. Going through and helping people plan out their day where they can finish up at a right time, or planning around measures or understanding when someone's going to come in early or come in on a Sunday, do they make a phone call to let you know that they're in there? And then you can go through a couple quick steps to help them remember what to watch out for. Some critical information to provide to your responding contractor is you really need to recognize that the information exchange is going to shape your emergency contractor's decision. How many people need to show up, what equipment needs to show up. If you call in and say, I have a spill and I think it's hydrochloric acid spilled, and 2 people show up to clean up hydrochloric acid, start asking questions, and then they're told, well, it might not be hydrochloric acid. There was one in the area, but it doesn't smell like it. I don't know exactly what it is. Now you have to step back, and 2 more people are coming in because you have an unknown atmosphere. So doing your investigation and letting your emergency contractor know what it actually is will, 1, help them get on site with the correct people and equipment, but 2, speed up how quickly this is cleaned. It's also going to allow your contractor to provide recommendations as some next steps you could do while waiting for the responders. Once you get the call in, they're going to bring in their staff, get the staff ready, and then dispatch them to your site. So depending on the distance, you could be anywhere from 60 to 180 minutes before you have a response based off of how much information you give up front. You want to make sure you give your name and phone number of the person who will be on site. If you're not the person on site, you shouldn't give them your name and number. You should give them the name and number of the person who they will be contacting when they show up on site. You can ask them to follow up with you to give you some steps as to where the response is, but giving the name and phone number of the person who's on site who's going to be managing this is going to be your best bet. The chemicals involved and whether you have an MSDS or an SDS now, if they're available, and then the site address, the building number and name, the room number or area that has the problem. If you're a large facility with 50 buildings, you can't just call and say, I'm at XYZ facility and I have a spill. Well, they could be going to 49 buildings before they get to the correct one where the spill is. So make sure you give the address and the correct building of where the problem is. If you're in a high-story building and there's 20 floors, well, which floor are you on so they know where to go? You also want to let your contractor know if there's been a release to the environment or is it contained within the building. If it's released to the environment, define the media that was affected. Is it soil, groundwater, surface water, concrete, asphalt? Each one of those type of media is going to change how the response is. If it's soil, how much soil needs to be removed? And do you need more than just bodies and shovels? Do you actually need some heavy equipment, some yellow metal equipment? If it's groundwater, where does the water go? And is there a way to extract that groundwater? If it went into surface water, like a stream or a brook, how far down should we be going down the stream to protect it? And how much boom do we need to get across that surface water? If it's concrete, are there any drains? And similarly with asphalt, are there any drains? One thing that's often overlooked with concrete and asphalt is, are there any cracks? Because if there are cracks in the concrete and the asphalt, well, now you're not just contaminating the surface of that concrete and paved area. You may now be contaminating the soil that's been beneath it as it went through the cracks. So you may have some excavation on top of the cleaning. And then if it's released down a drain, define where the drain goes. Does it go to a treatment system or does it go direct to sewer? You want to let them know the quantity released. This can cause worst case scenario if you don't know how much is released. A helpful tip, there's 7.48 gallons in a cubic foot. So if you think that you have a tank and you know how many cubic feet are in it and it's filled, you got to know how many gallons. And then what caused the release? Is this a release from a delivery? Did a contractor deliver material and their hydraulic line leaked? Or Was this, you were moving chemicals through a hallway, it spilled and went down a drain? Or did somebody pour a chemical down a non-chemical drain that doesn't go to your treatment system? It went down a sink that's not tied to it and it goes direct to sewer. Those are things that you want to be able to let your contractor know how this occurred. You also want to let them know what other agencies have been contacted and what actions have you taken prior to making the call, and also your expectations for cleanup. Now, sometimes when you make the initial call, you'll be letting your contractor know that no agencies have been contacted. And then 30 minutes later, while you're waiting, the DEP is there knocking on your door because a researcher or a worker or a walker by called the DEP because they thought they should report it. That often does happen. When that does happen, you should get a hold of your contractor and let them know that the DEP or there's an authority on site that was called in. That's not to give them a head, it's giving them a heads up, but it also allows them with the mentality to come in knowing that that agency is going to be running the spill until they feel it's safe enough to leave and leave under the contractor. So a few fascinating ER calls. We talked about critical information. This is information that you should probably not give in these ER calls. You do want to make sure that you give the correct phone number. One thing that has come up a few times is, please give me a call back. The person gives us a number, and then when we call, it says the number you've dialed is disconnected. You want to make sure that you're calm when you call in. One phone call that we received was actually, person was frantic on the phone and told us that the loading dock drum is on fire, please help, and then they hung up. It actually took about 15-20 minutes we kept calling back the number that came in, but had to go back through all of our systems, and we found the phone number attached to the person, who it was and what account, and started making phone calls and started the response from there. We did get a hold of that person 2 hours later, and it was actually a fire from a delivery, but make sure you're giving the correct information when you call in. And it's not a get here now, help. Give a little bit more information to help out your responders. Another one that has been called in, we talked about elevator shafts a little while ago, but one person had called in and said, I need you to clean out the elevator shaft. When we asked if it was locked out, they repeated the question and told us that you're the response company, you're supposed to know that information. Well, there's two contractors involved there, and there's a lot of elevator companies that are out there. So knowing who your elevator company is will help in guiding you as to when to call them, what they're needed for, and to have them respond to lock out the elevator. So some ways to prepare for an emergency and prepare for that time as you're waiting for your responders to show up on site is do a walkthrough of your facility. You want to understand your potential scenarios. Walk around with key staff and our contractors. And in some cases, I've been on these walkthroughs with clients where they've invited the DEP in, they've invited the EPA in, they've invited OSHA and the fire department. Now, oftentimes when people say, why don't you invite in the authorities, it's a very scary thought to bring them in. But in some cases, it can help you in the long run. Fire department, definitely having them come do the walkthrough, because they will most likely be your first responders if somebody calls 911, as they'll send out a dispatch of the fire department, any local hazmat that the fire department has, and then you would call your spill response company to come in and do their work. You want to assess your chemical storage practices. How are chemicals delivered? How are they handled? How are they moved? And where are they stored and how are they stored? You want to make sure that incompatibles are not stored together. Could you have a potential release that becomes larger because you have an acid and base stored on the same spill deck. You want to update your chemical inventory at least annually or more frequently if you have a large change of inventory through your system. You should be reviewing incidents with all of the people that are part of the group. Was there an incident that happened at your facility? What happened and what were the lessons learned to help you prepare for the next one? And one that not everybody does is reach out to colleagues, and not colleagues at your facility. You could reach out to colleagues at your facility, but also reach out to those that are similar business or colleagues that you have working at another facility and see how they deal with emergencies, because something that they're doing may fit into yours and will really help you build up your emergency response practices. Track your energetic or highly hazardous materials. Assess your treatment tanks. How much storage can you have in the treatment tank? Can you shut them off from discharge? We had one customer call us at one point where they had a 1,500 gallon treatment tank and asked what are some scenarios that could happen if it filled with the spill and we couldn't release. And some steps we talked about were putting a spare tote on site. If a tanker couldn't be there in enough time, could totes be delivered until a tanker was available? So just walking through some scenarios with the treatment tanks. Identify your high-risk areas for spills. If you have a chemical storage room that holds multiple gallons or has all of your reactives, is that your high-risk area? Then also update your contingency plan and walk through your contingency plan with everybody that's involved in your walkthrough to be prepared. Another big way to prepare is training. Training is going to be your number one defense for making an emergency response best case to worst case. You want to review observations from if you give a survey out to everybody or if you reach out to your colleagues. You want to talk about where your worst case scenarios are. Conducting mock drills is a great way to watch your people do a spill when it's not under pressure, but you're going to see that the steps that they would take. Some mock drills, we've been involved in a bunch of them with clients where it is unplanned for the people involved, although we're planning how the mock drill is going to go. And then testing your on-call system to make sure that it actually does work. You have somebody at the end of the line that you're going to be calling. And also limit who can make the call for outside help. We talked about what happened if an onlooker or walker by or someone in the lab calls the authorities to come in. You want to limit who's making those calls. So make sure the person calling is knowledgeable and make sure they're able to make decisions needed to clean up the spill. Making a phone call, say, I have a spill, it's to the environment, don't come until I have a quote, that doesn't fit under the regulations. You, as the incident commander for your facility or the spill response leader, need to be able to make those decisions to protect the environment. Some ways to prepare. Just one other question before we jump into the next part of preparing is, do you conduct regular emergency response training?
All right, and we'll do the same process here as we did before, launching that poll right now, and select a response and we'll share with the group. Do you conduct regular emergency response training, yes or no? All right, looks pretty close. We'll give it a couple more seconds, and we'll close that and share the results. So Kevin, surprisingly, we have 52% said no, and 48% of our audience does in fact conduct regular emergency response drills.
But it seems like a lot of people are, as we've done these over the last couple of years, we've started to see the numbers have been coming up as to who's doing mock drills. And these emergency response trainings and drills really do help. And if you are in that 52% that doesn't do them, there is a huge benefit to conducting these trainings. You're going to have a well-prepared staff who's going to be ready to do an emergency response, or they're also going to be trained to help not make it larger, because sometimes without training, when you have a spill, somebody tries to clean it up themselves and they actually make it a lot larger. We ran into this at one point with mercury, where a custodial staff had knocked over a mercury thermometer. Didn't tell anybody, thought they'd help out. They cleaned it up with the mop, put it right back into the bucket with water that they were mopping the rest of the facility with, and then they mopped the other 4 floors of that building, including the elevator. Unfortunately, that spread mercury throughout the facility, and that became a much larger response as it shut down a whole facility. So not just your EHS and your lab staff, but one thing to think about is also your custodial staff. Are they contracted or are they internal? And those are people that you'll also need to train. Just jumping back into